Thank you for joining the PIB webinar. This is our sixth webinar in 2017 series, and today's topic is the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. What have we learned? It looks to be a very popular webinar. We've had many people register, and if you're joining late from within IFPRI and other CG centers, please join some of your colleagues on the same computer and share so that we can accommodate possible future registrants and participants in the next few minutes. So my name is Frank Place. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the CGIAR Research Program on Policies, Institutions, and Markets. I am pleased to introduce our two speakers today. The first is Hazel Malapit, who is a Senior Research Coordinator at the Poverty, Health, and Nutrition Division at the International Food Policy Research Institute. She coordinates research, training, and technical assistance on the implementation of the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, or the WEAI. She manages and coordinates the integration of gender into the research of the CGIAR program on agriculture for nutrition and health, which is also led here at IFPRI, and conducts research on gender, women's empowerment, agriculture, health, and nutrition issues. Before joining IFPRI, she held the Herman Postdoctoral Fellowship in Gender and Economics at the University of Michigan in 2009 and 10, and conducted research on gender, labor market, and data issues at the World Bank's Gender and Development Unit. She received her MA in economics from the University of the Philippines and her PhD in economics from American University. Our second speaker is Cheryl Doss, who is a senior departmental lecturer in development economics, Department of International Development at Oxford University in the UK. Within our PIM program, Cheryl is a member of the program's management committee and leader of Flagship 6, a cross-cutting gender research and coordination. She is a development economist whose research focuses on issues related to assets, agriculture, and gender, with a regional focus on sub-Saharan Africa. Cheryl works with a range of international organizations on issues including best approaches for collecting sex disaggregated data, gender and agriculture, intra-household resource allocation, and women's asset ownership. In recent years, she has worked with the UN Forum, the UN Women, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the World Bank, DFID, the Africa Development Bank, and the UN Foundation on issues of women's asset ownership. She has published widely in academic journals in economics, agriculture economics, and development studies. Before I hand over to Hazel and Cheryl, let me explain how the webinar works. Our speakers will begin very shortly with a presentation that you will see on your screens, and it will last about 30 minutes. During the presentation, we encourage all of you to send in questions and comments if you have them via the chat and question windows that you'll see on the right side of your screens. We're going to collate myself and Evgenia, who works with us in communications. We're going to collate the questions and try to group them in a way so that we can get as many of them asked to the speakers after their presentation. We won't have audio ways of asking questions in this, and that'll hopefully make the best use of our time. We plan these for an hour. If there's a lot of questions, we may try to run a few minutes late, but we won't run very many minutes late to try to get all your questions. And so we're recording the webinar. We'll make it available on the website shortly after the event. And there may be possibilities of also engaging with the speakers after this presentation to follow up. So with that, I will hand over now to Hazel, I think, who will start, or Cheryl will start us off.
Thank you, Frank, and good morning to everybody. This is just all the people who are involved in the project, involved in collecting and analyzing the WEAI, the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. I thought I would just really briefly say that the WEAI is part of a number of different efforts that are being conducted right now, designed to improve data quality and data availability in order to do gender analysis. So that so much of what we've been trying to do for the last 25 years to understand issues around women and gender and agriculture, we've been really stuck by the lack of data. More and more this data is becoming available, and so the WEAI is one of these really exciting sets of data that can really provide us with insights into what's going on. So I'm going to turn it over to Hazel to talk about.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Cheryl, for that introduction, and Frank. So as Cheryl mentioned, the WEAI stands for the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. This was a tool that's about 5 years old. It was launched in 2012, so it's still relatively new. And it was originally designed as a monitoring and evaluation tool for the Feed the Future initiative. It was rolled out to their 19 Feed the Future countries soon after its launch. But since then, there have been a number of iterations of refinement and testing of the WEAI, and now we have about 47 countries where WEAI in some form or another has been implemented. So that's very exciting for us. I think it really reflects a lot of interest in collecting metrics around women's empowerment. So before I begin, I understand maybe some of you may not be as familiar with the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, so I'm just going to go over some of the basics around methodology and what it's designed to do, just to make sure we're all on the same page. So as I said, this was a tool that was developed in partnership between USAID, IFPRI, and the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, or OFI. And it was originally designed to measure inclusion of women in the agricultural sector for Feed the Future. Unlike other indices, this is a survey-based index. So what that means is that unlike other indices that rely on secondary information, for the WEAI, we use interviews of men and women in the same households to construct the indicator or the index. In terms of methodology, it really draws a lot on the methods around multidimensional poverty indices, so the Elkar-Foster method, and the Foster-Greer and Thorbecke indices. So if you're familiar with the poverty indices I just mentioned, the methodology really builds on that. And in fact, the way it's sort of reported is very similar to poverty as well, where we have one index that summarizes women's empowerment in a particular population or country, and that's the one number that summarizes empowerment. I'm not going to go into too much on the methodology, but for those of you who are interested in the construction of the index and how it's calculated, all of that is in a paper by Sabine Elkar and colleagues that's in World Development that should be public access. So how is it constructed? So like I said, the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index itself is a high-level index. So you just have the one number for a particular zone or particular country or population of interest. And it has two main components. So we have two sub-indices. One sub-index is called the 5 Domains of Empowerment, or 5DE for short. This is a sub-index that summarizes women's achievements in the 5 domains of empowerment in agriculture. And I'll explain what those are in a moment. Now, the second part of the WEAI is called the Gender Parity Index, or the GPI. So these summarizes women's achievements relative to the primary male in their household. So this is a measure of parity within households. And this is the unique part of this index because, like I said, we're constructing these indices based on interviews of both the men and the women, adults in the same household. So this gives us a measure of intra-household empowerment gaps. So the overall WEAI is a weighted average of those two sub-indices. And so what are the 5 domains? So on the right side of your screen, you have a chart that shows you the 5 domains on the left side. So we have production, resources, income, leadership. Oh, and time. It's a little cut off. It's actually not showing up in the chart. I'm sorry about that. But that there is a 5th dimension, time, at the bottom. And each of these domains are measured by a set of indicators on the right-hand side. And so they're all weighted equally. All the domains are weighted equally. And within each domain, all of these indicators within each domain are weighted equally. So the way it works is that based on, we conduct an interview with a primary male or a primary female respondent. Depending on the responses, we code them as either achieving or not achieving each of these indicators. So these are binary 0-1 indicators. And then we take the weighted average of that indicator and we come up with an empowerment score, which is just the weighted sum of their achievements. And so this is really the primary building blocks of the WEAI. So every person in our survey has an empowerment profile that tells us which indicators and domains do they achieve. And so empowerment is defined as 80% or higher. So if they have a score of 80% or higher or equivalent to 4 out of the 5 indicators, then or domains, then they're considered empowered. So that's sort of the minimum you would need for the WEAI. And like I said, for the details on methodology, we have a lot of other materials on our resource center, so feel free to take a look at those. So since the original launch of the WEAI and its rollout in Feed the Future, there have been a number of refinements. So we had, of course, the original WEAI, that was what Feed the Future used for their baseline, and these are intended to be population-based surveys, as I described. But one of the things that, main things that our partners realized on the field was that it was a long module. There was a lot of resource constraints around data collection, and so in our second round of piloting, we tried to come up with a shorter version of the survey called the abbreviated WEAI. And so the main difference between, so it looks actually very similar to the original, and that's why they're kind of the same. It's just a little smaller. So it's about 30% smaller than the original WEAI. It still has the 5 domains, but keeps only 6 out of the original 10 indicators. So that's the primary difference between the two. We've also added, we've made some minor improvements around format and sequencing and that sort of thing. So the abbreviated WEAI is a little bit lighter. And then, of course, when we as information around the WEAI became more widely available, a lot of users started implementing them in their own projects. And of course, because, as I said, the WEAI was originally designed as a tool for Feed the Future, other projects may not necessarily have the same objectives. They don't necessarily operate in the same context. And so necessarily they had, we do expect some adaptations and modifications to the tools. And that's really where this demand for the project level WEAI came from. So this is coming out of, feedback we heard from all the users who said, well, I really want to measure women's empowerment, but in my project, this is our intervention. And in our project, these are our objectives. It's not exactly what WEAI is measuring. So in Project WEAI, we're developing a project level version of this tool where we're trying to maintain a degree of comparability, but also allow for adaptation depending on project type and project context. And I'll talk about that a bit more later. Now, another round of testing is going on in what we're calling the WEAI for value chains, or the WEAI for VC. And this is really building on the Pro WEAI work. So it draws on a lot of the lessons we're learning there, but then adds on expanding production to livelihood. So getting at rural entrepreneurship and wage work beyond just production. And so the attempt here is to try to go beyond production and cover the entire value chain. So why do we need different WEAIs? Obviously, there are, like I said, different users have different needs, and so in our refinement of the WEAI, we're trying to respond to the need for these development organizations to try to measure empowerment in a way that makes sense for their particular project or program. I would like to add a quick caveat here. I know many people are very excited about Pro WEAI and WEAI for value chains. Of course, we are also quite excited about what we'll find as we develop these indicators. But I want to emphasize that these are all under development. So these actually are indices that do not yet exist. they exist, in theory. We have proposed indicators, and I'll show you some of our preliminary results later. But I just want to emphasize that, yeah, please be patient. It's coming. So right now we're still in the period of testing and development, but we're certainly getting there to a point where we'll be ready to share the indices once they're ready. So a bit more detail on what Project WEAI is and how it's being done. So this is actually being developed under a project called Gender, Agriculture, and Assets Project, or GAP2. This is phase 2 of this project. It's a project that's supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, USAID, and the CGIAR Research Program on Agriculture for Nutrition and Health. So what it does is it uses the abbreviated WEAI as a starting point, because, everybody was saying it's too long and I don't need all these things. How do I make it suit my project needs? And so we started with the AWEA, which is sort of the short version of the index, and then asked the projects, well, what is it that it's important for you to be able to track your impact on women's empowerment? What do you want to measure, and how do you want to measure that? So in Project WEAI, we're adding sort of intervention-specific modules and questions, but we are doing it in this portfolio approach. So we're working with a portfolio of 13 agricultural development projects who are co-designing these modules with us. And so we're all kind of in a test kitchen together, testing these new recipes. And once they're ready for a broader taste test, you'll know once we're ready. So really, what's in the Project WEAI, we're envisioning it as having a core set of pro-WEAI empowerment modules. So there's a quantitative survey component to that and a qualitative protocol, and these are a set of sort of your minimum requirements that everybody who's working on women's empowerment needs to collect, regardless of project design or where they're working. So we're calling that, we're trying to boil this down to a core set of modules. And then on top of that, depending on project needs and project goals, we are developing standardized add-ons. That's, for one is on nutrition and health. So for nutrition programs, this is an add-on that they could include on top of the core module. And then also for livestock projects in particular, we're designing additional add-on sub-questions. So this is not exactly a new module, but it's a sort of an expanded, a more disaggregated way of collecting the core module so that it gets at more specific questions and decisions around livestock projects. So that's sort of the idea. And like I said, this is still under development, so stay tuned for that. On WEAI for value chains, so this is really trying to expand the empowerment measure to cover multiple stages and different types of actors in the value chain. And one of the limitations really of the original WEAI was that it focuses a lot on production. And doesn't capture, it's there, but it's not as well captured. Processing, for example, is not as well captured. Entrepreneurship and wage work are not as well captured. So this is a way to sort of expand the measurement of empowerment to those types of actors. And because, just because of timing, we were already working on Project WEAI, so of course, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. Let's just build on what we're already testing. So what it does is it uses pro-WEAI as its starting point, and we're using both the quantitative and the qualitative protocols. So this is sort of a mixed methods. Both Project WEAI and WEAI for value chains are using mixed methods to develop these tools. And right now we're doing 2 sets of pilots. So the first pilot, like just time, in terms of timing, this really happened first. So this is a pilot in the Philippines, and this is supported by the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Their idea was really to use WEAI as a diagnostic, and that's really where we want people to start thinking about using this instrument. Ideally, you get the most bang for your buck when you integrate it from the very beginning and use the information to design interventions. So this is intended to sort of feed into the process of developing MCC investments for the second compact for the Philippines. And the idea was to assess empowerment and gender parity for women across 4 priority value chains, which the Philippine government has identified. So abaca, coconut, seaweed, and swine are their priority commodities. And we've done a pilot survey with about 1,600 households in 4 provinces in the Philippines. Now, there is a second pilot happening in Bangladesh for WEAI for VC, and this one is supported by the Bangladesh mission of the USAID. Here, the focus is slightly different. So unlike in the Philippines where they're looking at specific value chains, here there's no specific value chain, specific commodity they're focusing on, but they did want to look at the value chain in general. So here we're assessing empowerment and gender parity of women as producers, entrepreneurs, and wage workers. So there's slightly different focus here, but the instruments that we're using are harmonized. So here they did a pilot survey on 12,000 households in Feed the Future zones, so about 400 per group. And right now, qualitative work is ongoing in these 2 pilots. So just another caveat. So in talking about these tools, and I'm going to be mentioning some of our proposed indicators, but many of these things do not necessarily survive in the final version. So just a word of warning that the things I might talk about today are not the final indicators yet. These are all preliminary. And of course, anybody who's using these sort of pilot tools, be forewarned, there may be deep holes, dangerous currents, and slippery rocks as you implement them. So if you want something that's validated, then you can go ahead and wait until we've done that side of the validation and we're ready to release. So on to the lessons. What have we learned? So I was thinking of talking about sort of 3 sets of results that are somewhat slightly different. So the first one I wanted to talk about was the Feed the Future findings. So these are baseline findings from the initial rollout in Feed the Future. So here we have 13 out of the 19 Feed the Future countries. And what we have here are the disempowerment index. So the length of the bars represent the extent of disempowerment in each of these Feed the Future zones. So these are not necessarily national representative. These are representative of project areas in Feed the Future. Now, the nice thing about the index, and I think one of its most useful features, is its decomposability. So what does that mean? So apart from having a high-level index that summarizes women's empowerment overall in a particular population of interest, we can also decompose it into which domains and which indicators contribute to that disempowerment. And this is really useful for program design because it tells us where we need to focus on, where are the key constraints. So where especially in a scenario of resource constraints, what should we prioritize? And so here we find the findings from the baseline. Overall, what we're finding is that credit, access to credit, workload, and group membership are the constraints that appear most frequently across these 13 countries. And the really useful thing to look at in this chart is that you could have 2 countries that have the same overall extent of disempowerment, like say Nepal and Zambia, which is right around the middle in that chart, and it tells you they have the same overall extent of empowerment, but the contributions, the patterns of disempowerment are somewhat different. And what that means is that the policy response of interventions that could help overcome those are also different. So just to point out, for example, group membership in Nepal, that's a larger contributor to disempowerment among women in Nepal compared to Zambia. And so if we were thinking of having a program that tries to expand group membership, that may be more effective in closing those gaps for Nepal compared to Zambia. Now, what happened since baseline? So now we're a few years off baseline. Many of these countries have now collected midline data. And so what I wanted to show you next was what are the midline trends? How has empowerment moved, or how have these indicators moved since baseline? So Here's one example on access to and control over credit. So here I'm just showing you one of the indicators of the WEAI. And basically the length of the boxes that you see here are the differences between baseline and end line. And when the difference is green, then it means that the indicator increased. When it's red, it means it decreased. So you have green bars and red bars. So of course, if we're trying to, if we realize that credit access to and control over credit was a key constraint at baseline, we want to improve that. We want to narrow down those gaps. And so we want to see greens. But is that necessarily good? Is green always good? Is red always bad? Well, the way we would like users to look at this is to use this information to see if you're on the right track. So if it's green, it raises a question. What's behind this change? Does it make sense? So if you're not doing anything new around your project on credit and you see green, then it might be due to something else. And it's worth sort of figuring out why you're seeing improvement in that. Maybe there could be shocks during the period, like a big natural disaster or some new other change, some other structural change in the economy that have occurred. So all of those things could it could be red, but maybe you were expecting a bigger drop because there was some big disaster, for example. So maybe even a small red is good news, right? So it really depends on what's behind this change, but this is really asking us to sort of dig deeper and look at the composition of what's driving these changes. Here's another example for workload. Again, lots of green. But the tricky thing about workload is that in the WEAI, workload enters in the negative, meaning that if you're overworked, then that's disempowering. But just working more in general, you need to pass a threshold for it to be considered time burden, right? So here it's telling us that a lot of women all of a sudden are falling below that threshold, but it depends why they're falling below the threshold, right? If it depends on what types of their activities are they no longer spending time on or why. So, for example, if they're doing less drudgery at home because now they have like improved water supply, then that's good. That's the kind of change we're looking for. But if it's because there was a disaster and now there's no post-process harvesting work for them and they lost their livelihood, then it's bad. And they could show up as not being overworked, but it's, there could be other sort of changes happening. Okay. So next I wanted to move on to another set of results where we've used WEAI data. So here, this is really joint work between Agnes Kisumbing, Catherine Spruill, Elena Martinez, and myself. So these are preliminary results. And we're looking at what dimensions of empowerment matter for maternal and child nutrition. So in this analysis, we're using baseline data from Feed the Future in Bangladesh, Cambodia, Ghana, Mozambique, and Tanzania. For Nepal, we're using a different project data called Suahara, which is a nutrition project, but also supported by USAID. All of these data sets represent project areas except for Bangladesh, which is nationally representative of rural areas. And in this study, what we were looking at was trying to see the relationship between nutrition outcomes and women's empowerment using quantitative analyses. And we also looked at differential effects on nutrition of girls compared with boys. So here, we're not talking about causality, we just wanted to take a look at whether these measures of empowerment are associated with or not the different dimensions of empowerment that comprise the index. So here's one first set of results. So here, the measure of empowerment that we're using for these first set is the empowerment score. So I talked about how this is the primary building block of the WEAI. So this is the women's empowerment score. And we ran regressions between that and different nutrition outcomes. So the nutrition outcomes that you see on the horizontal axis, we have the household hunger score, women's dietary diversity, body mass index, height for age, weight for height, and weight for age Z scores, exclusive breastfeeding, and child dietary diversity score. So every bar that you see here is a separate regression, and it controls for a bunch of other characteristics. Now, when you can't see the bar, that means it's not significant. So we've deliberately sort of blurred that out so that you could kind of see the estimate broadly, but we're not highlighting that for now because they weren't statistically significant. And what we're reporting here are effect sizes. So this is the number of sample standard deviations in the household, maternal and child nutrition variables that are associated with a one standard deviation change in the empowerment measure, in which case it's the 5DE score. So here what I wanted to point out was that, first of all, obviously we see much more action in our Asian samples compared to the African samples. And then there is not quite a clear relationship between women's empowerment and nutrition outcomes. So, there's, like I said, context matters a lot. And, it certainly matters more for Bangladesh, Nepal, and Cambodia, as we're finding. And then so whenever the label is red, these are results that are contrary to what we're expecting. So for women's dietary diversity score in Bangladesh, body mass index in Nepal, and exclusive breastfeeding, we're finding that those are positively associated with women's empowerment score. And then for Bangladesh household hunger score and Bangladesh women's body mass index, we're finding that those are negatively associated with empowerment score. And so one thing to note here is that because we are looking at the empowerment score as a weighted score, if the directions of associations are different, then they could be canceling each other out. And so that may partly be the reason why sometimes we don't see a significant relationship. Okay, moving on to the next empowerment measure. So here we look at what we're calling inter-household inequality score. So this is just the difference between the female empowerment score and the male empowerment score. So a higher inequality score means more inequality in the household. A lower score means more equality. So again, the red labels means those are contrary. Our prior here is that greater inequality would improve nutrition outcomes within the household. But here, it's not always the case, although we do find that we find more stronger results in other countries. So we have Nepal, Cambodia, Tanzania showing up as, within expectations. So basically what we're pointing out here is that apart from the exceptions in Bangladesh, gender equality within households are associated with positive nutritional outcomes, which suggests that nutritional programs that aim at improving inter-household inequality could have greater impacts that those do not. And so this really emphasizes perhaps the importance of a household working together to generate good nutrition for the family. So that's one of our takeaways. I have an example here of a specific country where because of the difficulty in trying to figure out, well, if the empowerment overall isn't showing a significant relationship with nutrition outcomes, then maybe there are certain components actually that are the key components that can make a difference and not the overall index. And that's what we're trying to do here. So here on the horizontal axis, we have, as our measures of empowerment, we're looking at the subcomponents of the index. So we're looking at not the binary indicator, but the continuous sort of raw indicator that's used to calculate those WEAI indicators. So we have agricultural decisions, extent of autonomy in production, agricultural assets owned, assets with rights, credit decisions, and so forth. So as before, so here again, we see a mixed picture. So some things appear to be, positively associated with nutrition outcomes, and some do not. So for example, having more decisions around agricultural production and having more decisions around agricultural assets do not necessarily improve a woman's own dietary diversity or her BMI. And that may not be too strange if we think that that's actually driving, if there's energy expenditure involved with doing more agriculture, and that could be, if that's not compensated with higher calories, then you're not going to see improvements in BMI, for example. So that might be behind that. Now, in terms of ours work, for example, we're seeing a negative effect in women's BMI, and that's sort of consistent with what I just described. On the other hand, we are finding positive associations between making more decisions over having more control over income, speaking up in public, and satisfaction with leisure, and those are significant. Those are associated, positively associated with women's own nutrition outcomes. So those are just some highlights of what we're finding. And here are some of the broader lessons that we found in that set of studies. So, like I said, overall empowerment appears more important in Asian countries. Gender equality within households are almost always associated with positive nutrition outcomes. But then that trade-offs could exist between these agriculture and nutrition pathways and women's empowerment. So just because they're making more decisions doesn't necessarily mean we can expect that women's own nutrition outcomes would improve. So here are some of the other broader lessons around policy. So maybe we could talk about that later on once we talk about policy more broadly. Let me get to some more, these are the freshest results, I guess, from this presentation. These are like hot off the presses. So these are some findings that we're reporting on the WEAI for Value Chains Philippines work. And basically here, so like I said, we don't have yet the WEAI for value chain. So what we've done as a first sort of cut was, well, let's calculate the regular WEAI, the original WEAI, because that's sort of a subset of the broader thing we're testing. So in doing that, we come up with this empowerment scores for the different value chains. So we have the different value chains on your left, and we have them for men and women. So again, the length of the bars shows you the extent of this empowerment in that particular group. And then the composition are the colors. And what's really striking here is that across the board, even though there are different value chains and across men and women, we find that group membership and workload are the largest contributors to this empowerment overall. So that's really interesting here. Now, like I said, this still is mostly focused on production, and this is still not, it doesn't yet include entrepreneurship and wage work. Okay, so now here is another thing we thought was really interesting to look at is to say, okay, then now what are then the gaps, by indicator? Can we tell where are the gender gaps? And like I said, this is really an attempt to feed into the project design process for the second Philippine Compact. So if you were designing a project in the Philippines and you wanted to make sure it included women in a particular value chain, what should you focus on? So here I have all the proposed sub-indicators that includes all this proposed WEAI for value chain indicators on the left. We've grouped them by domain. So we have, instead of production, we now have a broader livelihoods domain. We have a resources domain, income, leadership, time. We have some indicators around inter-household relationships and access to information and extension. And the colors that you see are the average achievement gaps by gender. So when it's green, it means that there is a gender gap and it favors men. And when it's purple, there is a gender gap and it favors women. And when it's blank, it means there's no gap. They're about the same achievements. And then the rankings, I'll talk about the rankings later, but the rankings just rank the size of the gaps. So here it's just wherever there's a gap. So those can be big gaps, those can be small gaps. The numbers tell you which ones are the bigger ones. So just as a first, glance, just looking at the colors, we see production is very green. There's about a mix of purples and greens and resources and income. And again, time is universally green. So that workload indicator favors men. And then for intra-household relationships and extension, it's for intra-household relationships, it favors men, and for access to information, it's a bit of a mix. So let's look at one. Oops, actually, let me jump to coconut because the contrast is much more stark. So in coconut, we see a lot of green. So overall, across all of these indicators, we see more of these gender gaps are favoring men. So that's certainly an argument for, if we want to include women, we really need to think about what, how they might be, how they might be, how the project might be designed to include them. And apart from several aspects where women have, where women's achievements are higher than men. So one is access to a financial account, which was quite interesting. That's also the largest gender gap here. And then we have group member workload and mutual respect. Now contrast that with seaweed, which is a bit more of a mix. Okay, so let me just jump to our summary findings. So basically, so overall, I didn't show you the overall WEAI scores, but just wanted to comment that overall the WEAI scores look relatively high compared to the Feed a Future scores or to the scores in other, especially South Asian countries where we've collected the WEAI. That's maybe not very surprising for those of us who are familiar with its context, because gender norms in the Philippines are relatively more egalitarian compared to, say, Bangladesh or Nepal. There are some very consistent findings across value chains, especially around workload and group membership being top constraint. This is also consistent, by the way, with those baseline Feed the Future findings, where these are also two of those key constraints that they found. Very low achievements in autonomy in wage work and working conditions, so that's really interesting. And then, like I said, some sub-indicators favor men, some favor women. So in terms of program design, this is really, I think this implies that we really need to think of ways of reducing time burdens, especially when we're trying to think of ways of engaging women. Groups in particular may not be an effective delivery platform for interventions. And like I said, that group membership was both for women and for men. So even if you weren't doing any sort of gender-specific sort of targeting, that's something to think about and consider in design. And I just want to talk about limitation of the WEAI. It tells us what constraints to pay attention to. It doesn't necessarily tell us how to overcome them. And this is just a pointer and tells us we need more qualitative work to dig deeper. That's ongoing right now in Philippines, Bangladesh, so stay tuned for those results. So this is just one example of how WEAI results were used for programming. Maybe I won't go too much into detail on that, but I could talk about that in Q&A. And yeah, and so what's next for WEAI? So testing and adaptation are ongoing. There's quite a lot of interest, as maybe also evidenced by the number of registrants to this webinar. And also we're exploring integration of WEAI international surveys. So we're having ongoing discussions with FAO, World Bank, and the Gates Foundation. Cheryl.
So I was asked to say a little bit about putting some of this in context. I'm going to be really brief so we have time for questions. I think one of the things, if we think about what we have learned from the work that's been done on the WEAI, is that there's a lot of demand for ways to measure women's empowerment, and that it needs to be tailored to specific contexts and specific kinds of questions. And so having gone from the initial WEAI, there's now a range of variations on the WEAI that are being developed to meet some of those kinds of needs. So some are now available, and for some of them you need to stay tuned. I think the second thing is thinking about what's next is there's now starting to be quite a bit of this data available. And so there's really scope for a lot more analysis for us to try to understand how empowerment is related to everything else that we care about. Right. I could make a long list, but all of you have something in particular that you care about, and I think this data is starting to be able to help us understand that. So for those of you who are researchers participating in this webinar, thinking about how you can use this in some of the data that's already been collected to help answer your questions. I think this issue of how we understand women's empowerment, thinking about it both as an individual measure of empowerment, how it fits within their households and families. We've got the gender parity gap, but also thinking about how it's related to communities. And I think we've got, now that we're starting to have that data, we can start to understand how that plays out, how it affects women's empowerment when they're the one empowered woman versus whether lots of women are empowered in their communities. And then I think another piece that we're working on, but that's really critical, is trying to understand how these questions and modules can best be incorporated into national surveys so that we have more standard data available to do comparisons across contexts. And I will stop there and open it up for questions.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you very much. That was very interesting. I actually came up with a few questions of my own that maybe I'll have a chance to pose. There were a couple of questions related to the methods, so maybe I'll ask those first about the WEAI methods. So one, I think, was seeking just a little bit more clarity about the use of mixed methods, because you talked about the index, but then you also talked about qualitative protocols, and so how does that work?
Sure. So in the original way, as part of the pilot and the development process for that, they did conduct case studies that sort of helped to validate those indicators. So that was done in the beginning, before, as it was being designed and before it was launched, and that really guided some of those decisions around about what are the domains and indicators that ended up in the original index. Now, since then, it's not been a required component of the WEAI. So whenever people have been doing the WEAI, it's mostly a quantitative sort of tool. But in Project WEAI, we realize, especially if we're trying to get at those nuances, that there's really no way to get around, these questions except by doing more sort of qualitative work. And we wanted to think about how we might do that more systematically. And so in Project WEAI, we developed a set of qualitative protocols that we're envisioning as working sort of side by side and in a coordinated way with the quantitative instruments. So our idea was that these would be tools that people would be using together. But yeah, we have draft protocols and we're still testing them. Okay. So yes.
Maybe two other questions on this is, well, it was someone had asked a question about whether you include access to information in the WEAI, in the first WEAI, because they saw that later it was tested in the value chain one. Right. But how is access to information included in the
no, WEAI? In the original WEAI, it wasn't, and I think maybe if when Agnes or Ruth are online, they could talk about the original thinking around this. But I think my understanding was that it would be expected. Of course, the WEAI is just one module in a bigger survey, right? And so you would expect, I think, that different projects have different sort of questions around the types of information that make sense, and then whether it made sense to standardize that was not clear. But for the value chains, it came back, and because people did say, well, actually, we do need to measure this. So we now have been testing that, and we haven't quite decided yet where to put it in, whether it's under production or its own domain, but we're looking into it.
Okay. And then lastly, there was a question about participation in groups and how that was measured. If you have a short, I mean, of course, we'll refer to your website, but
yeah. So in the original WEAI, this is defined as active membership in at least one group, and it could be any group, and it could be any formal or informal group. And the idea is that people have different ways of getting information, and that being in a group by itself contributes to empowerment. In the subsequent, I think in Project WEAI and in WEAI for value chains, we did expand groups to cover sort of to get into more on like roles in the groups and decisions around groups and how influential somebody is in the groups. I don't have the wording quite in mind right now, but yeah, but we're looking into sort of going deeper into those questions.
Yeah. Well, Agnes, I mean, for those online, Agnes has given a little bit of a response about extension question. So she said that, I don't know if everybody online can read it anyway. Or no. Okay, so she said that they didn't include extension because in the pilot everyone was disempowered with respect to extension, but pilots were based on a small sample size, so they realized that it's important to include an extension indicator because we need to find out the extent to which men and women are reached by extension agents. So I guess that's why it came in later on. Okay, so then there were a few questions related about to now not on the WEAI per se, but when you presented the results on nutrition. So there was if you could give a little flavor for why certain indicators are included as part of nutrition, and I think some people asked specifically, how about obesity, anemia, some of these other kinds of things, and also whose health is being covered, men, women, children,
right.
Some of these.
Yeah, so actually this gets at to one sort of limitations around what kind of questions can we ask around empowerment and other outcomes. So we were limited by the types of nutrition outcomes that were in the data set that was collected for the same household. So that's one sort of driving reason why we chose the indicators we did. We have sort of a household level measure, which is that household hunger score. We have the women's nutrition outcomes, which is the women's dietary diversity and body mass index. And then we have the children's anthropometry, Z-scores, and feeding, sort of breastfeeding and diet outcomes. But on anemia, I mean, that's sort of not standard. We don't usually find that necessarily. And so if that's not in the data, then it's hard to include. But also for this particular study, we were trying to do a cross-country analysis. So it was actually really important to make sure we have sort of standard definitions and sort of the same indicators across the board. And so that's one of the reasons why we chose that. In the PowerPoint, actually, there's that I think we'll be releasing after the webinar. We have the definitions as well of all the acronyms that you see in the chart.
I think just that, right, the WEAI is the module measuring women's empowerment, and if people want to be able to compare women's empowerment with something else, all of these other things that we care about, then that data has to be collected as well, and what else is being collected is not being defined by the WEAI itself. It's that the WEAI gets embedded in these larger surveys that have more or less information on nutrition or some of these other outcomes that we might care about.
Okay, just a question about the timing of the ones that you're piloting now. When might people expect that they could be ready for use?
So right now project GAP 2 is a 5-year project, so the very final will come at the end. But we are coming up with sort of draft pro WEAI relatively soon. I think by early next year or by spring, and we're planning to have some tools on our resource center around that soon after that. For value chains, it's very early for value chains. People are literally still just either in the field or coming back from the field, so it'll take a bit more time. But maybe I'm hopeful by next year for these two things we will have a draft to share.
Okay. So what another question that came in is a little about the gender composition of the people involved in developing these tools and also in the field. So they were wondering if how is the team also kind of balanced in some way. I mean, we know for him we have had a research fellow, Greg Seymour, who's been involved with.
Yes.
So we know that there's some.
We'll count him.
Yeah. And the other question is also when they're in the field asking these questions, who's asking questions to men and women and others?
So our standard guidance is that we prefer having male interviewers interview men and female interviewers interview the women. And that, I think, works well most places. Sometimes it's not always possible due to availability of trained sort of enumerators, but to the extent that that's possible, that I think would be the best. And in terms of gender balance of the teams, I haven't actually quite thought about that, but just thinking about our teams, in the data whose firm in Bangladesh that helps us with a lot of our WEAI data collection. The main point people are men, but their teams are women and men. The enumerators are women and men. In the development team, well, I guess we are a little unbalanced, but at least we have Greg. We have people on our advisory committee in GAP2 that are men, right? And maybe Agnes knows who better. But yeah.
Probably weren't expecting that kind of question.
No, I didn't expect that kind of question at all. Next time I'll come with a tally.
So one question on the analysis that some of the analyses you present on the nutritional outcomes. So one question was how are you running different regressions for results on different types of people in a household? So is it nutrition? Is it you're looking at household composites or separately men, girls and boys and things like that? That's one question.
Yeah.
And then maybe another one, I'll just, because it's also really, this one is also from me though. I was thinking formerly when people didn't have a WEAI index or these other kinds of measures of inequality, they just ran the same regressions on these nutritional indicators, but without that additional information. So I don't know if you've had some experience of running them regressions with and without these new variables that you have at hand and seeing how other factors change in their influence from what we used to think was
right.
or the explanatory factors. So that's so those two questions. So it's about the nuancing of the regressions.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if we did that second bit, but that would be actually interesting. I wish Katie was here so I could ask her if we actually did that. But on the regressions, so your first question was around at what level did we run the regressions at? So I think, depending on the outcome, if it was at the household level, it was at the household level. If it was a woman level and child level, depending on the outcomes. Now in terms of the empowerment measure, though, we don't put all the empowerment measures on the right hand side in one go. We kind of run separate ones, and then we have a bunch of individual household and community controls as well.
Good. So a question came in because they were noticing that of course some of your results are based on project sites households. So in that sense, they were wondering if you actually have some control versus treatment households in your sample that you could look at in these regressions.
So in GAP2 we will, because that's actually part of the requirements for participating in GAP2 was there has to be sort of a good design, impact assessment design. But for these, not necessarily, and and that's just because this is how their surveys were designed. So
right. So I know you didn't have control over the design of the larger projects, but they were just curious whether you could get more out of.
If you collect it that way, then of course you could, right? That would be actually really nice to test. But we hope to do those types of look at those types of analyses in Project WEAI, not for WEAI for value chains, but for Project WEAI, yes.
So there's I think this could be the last one, but I'll encourage people if they have any other questions to get them out now, because otherwise we'll close out. But we have a nice kind of a summary type of question that came in. But just a general question. So the WEAI is one tool to look at gender inclusion, and it's very helpful. Are there maybe this is a part slightly broader than the WEAI itself, but the question was: are there readily available manuals for gender inclusion at policy and project levels to help these organizations to help bring gender dimensions into their projects and so forth? So WEAI, of course, is one, but I think there's also a question: are there other actions out there?
Well, I know that sort of Cultural Practice, who is our qualitative partner and is working with us on both GAP2 and WEAI for value chains, have a lot of kind of toolkits and materials around that. There's also a women's a WEAI intervention guide that I think was put out by, I forget now which project, but this was a USAID sort of effort, and that one actually shows you the different components of the index, and then shows examples of how you might sort of design your project to address it. So that might be a useful. It's called the WEAI Intervention Guide.
Okay. Yeah. Good. That's good. So we can you know, if we follow up, we'll try to give links to all these things that have been mentioned. So it'll help everyone. So thanks.
And just to plug the resource center that's on that, you should be seeing it on your screen now. So we have a link to all of our instruments and tools and presentations and all of that on the IFPRI website. And then for GAP2 updates and Project WEAI updates, please take a look at the gap.ifpri.info GAP2 webpage for more details.
Okay. Well, we did have one more other question on your methods, so so
okay.
if that's okay now. So
Sure,
one last one came in. So it's just really about these add-ons. You know, you said you had for these new tools, you have a core and an add-on.
Right.
So there was a little bit of a question about, well, how is it determined which ones you're working on, and then how did you adapt? In specific, how did you adapt? You know, nutritional indicators for maybe you can give the example of that one.
So for the nutrition module, so this is an add-on that asks about, so just to clarify that this is not asking about nutrition outcomes. This is about empowerment around decisions that affect nutrition. So these are like decisions on what to feed, or, you know, if you were pregnant and lactating, do you eat eggs, or who decides if you can eat eggs, things like that. And so now, I think if you're a nutrition project, then it would make sense to collect it. If you're not really, if you don't have any specific nutrition intervention, or if you don't expect changes around nutrition specifically, it's a little, you know, it doesn't make sense to add it. We kind of leave it to the projects to determine what makes sense for them. But we don't know quite yet how this will fit in with the core, or, you know, like in terms of weighting, like all of that is to be determined.
Good. Well, I'll leave you if you have any other final words in closing.
Final words?
If not, that's also fine.
I mean, I think just on that last point, right, is that there's a number of nutrition projects that are part of GAP2 that are implementing various versions of this and trying to figure out what works, so that we're really trying to implement it in the field, sort of hands-on with projects that are going to be able to use these particular tools. And by being part of the project, that's what they've agreed to, is to be part of this process of developing it, partly so that they have something that they can use.
Right. Oh, that's a great clarification. I also just wanted to add one last thing, is that these standardized add-ons, we're kind of developing them to be comparable within clusters of projects. So it won't be, so if you're a nutrition project, all the nutrition projects who are collecting the same nutrition add-on should have comparable metrics within that cluster. And the same should be the case for like livestock projects in how we're envisioning the livestock enhanced version. So it's not, I mean, I hope I didn't give the impression that you could kind of just pick and choose what to take out of this module, but that you would implement the standardized module if this was an objective that made sense in your project.
Okay, well, great. Thank you very much. Thank you for we had a large number of listeners, which we very much appreciated, and thanks for your questions. And, you know, feel free to follow up on any of these issues through the Policies, Institutions, and Markets program, and we'll get all your questions to the right people. The presentation will be available on the PIM website, which is www.pim.cgir.org. And plus, we'll also send a link in a follow-up email.
Yes, to all the registrants.
To all the registrants.
There will be a direct email from us.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And that's the last one we'll have this year, but we will have a new edition in 2018.
Gonna end it with a bang.
Yes, exactly. So thanks to Hazel and Cheryl once again. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.